Good afternoon, viewers. Welcome to this series of lectures on modern European history. As you can recollect, we have earlier covered the backdrop of the modern European history, the expanse of the syllabi usually covered by most of the universities at the undergraduate level. Thereafter, we went on to discuss the causes and the broader context of the French Revolution and the immediate context of the French Revolution in terms of causes. And today we undertake a discussion around the course of the French Revolution. So, as we all know, 1789 is the time when the French Revolution began, and it is studied by historians today to be progressing in different stages. Obviously, it was not a very calibrated, conscious progression of the revolution as such by the revolutionaries themselves, but it is part of the strategy with which historians subsequently look at this iconic event in terms of stages. And therefore, this particular lecture is about the initial stage, that is the stage 1, the first stage of the French Revolution. And as you can see on your slide, 1789 to 1792 is the time that is accorded to the first stage of the French Revolution. And at this stage, since we have discussed this before, we all know that most of these changes were initiated through the instrument of legislative measures. We have earlier discussed as to how the reconvening of Etats Generaux or States Generals in 1789 actually led to that tennis court incident, and subsequently National Assembly was formed, and where instead of legislating and deliberating with respect to only their estates, all the three orders, all the three states of French society now were legislating at the national level, and they were legislating as citizens and not as members of a specific state. So that's how the nation France had come into being. Yet one has to be mindful of the fact that France still was not in the first stage a republic, and by republic we mean when the head of the state is elected and not nominated or dynastically, as it is almost bequeathed as kings in past. So in the first stage, in the revolution, we find whatever changes that were brought in through largely the legislative measures at the National Assembly. So what are those changes? If we have a look at that, we find that the feudal privileges that characterized pre-modern France or pre-revolutionary France, for example, ecclesiastical teats, corvée, these were some of the taxes that were distinctly feudal and were imposed on the third state. Similarly, we have the monopolies and taxation exemptions accorded to the first two orders, that is clergy and the nobility, which characterized feudal France. All these feudal taxes, monopolies and taxation exemptions were done away with, were eliminated. Similarly, hunting privileges to the aristocrats, that was also done away with, that was also abolished. And sale of offices. It is said that had France continued with this corrupt practice of offices being sold to the highest bidder or to those who get it by fraudulent means or through corruption, it would not have been possible for meritorious army people like Napoleon himself to have risen to the ranks that he did subsequently. So the sale of offices, that was yet another characteristic feature of feudal France, that was also done away with through legislative measures. Then all of us know about this iconic document that Thomas Paine came to create, which goes on as the Rights of Man and the Citizens. This was in September 1789, and this very eloquently articulated the purpose, content, and also the aspirations of the revolution. Declaration of property, liberty, security, and resistance to oppression as a natural right. What do we mean by this? We mean that as man is born, there are some inalienable rights with which a man is born, and property becomes an inalienable right. That is, right to property. Why are we, or what is the context in which we should understand this? The context is that it is the bourgeoisie. It is the trading class, it is the professional class, it is those who were making good money through commercial and trade enterprise, and also a little bit of manufacturing, because French Revolution almost goes parallel with Industrial Revolution, although Industrial Revolution is not has not impacted France to a great extent at this point of time in 1789, but subsequently it did. So the entrepreneurs who were making money through the new avenues of commerce, trade, manufacturing, and so forth, or through professional successes, they obviously had come to acquire property, and that property needed protection, and that protection was given or was sought to be given through the Constitution itself. That was a big break. So it could not be confiscated, it could not be taken away from them, and that gave a lot of security to the capitalist spirit, that if you earn more and more profit, it will accrue to you, it will be with you, it cannot be taken away from you, and it is almost equal to liberty, security, and resistance to oppression. Now, resistance to oppression as a natural right is a revolutionary step, in the sense that the immediate backdrop of this revolution is feudalism, right? So then no less important is the fact that, as per this document articulating the aspirations of the revolutionaries, sovereignty was to rest in people. So sovereignty earlier rested in the monarch, in the king, right? Now it was to rest in people. That means that when people decide through constitutional means in the designated fora, which in French case is the National Assembly, then there is no power on earth that could change it, or there is no power on earth that could coerce it to change it. So the people of France are free to decide for themselves as to what they are going to do. So that is sovereignty, right? And that was to rest in people. Again, it's a major departure from the feudal ethos. Similarly, in the first stage, we also find that laws or provisions were made where the church land was confiscated, and it was confiscated with the purpose of serving as collateral for the newly launched currency in France, that was assignat. As all of us know that paper currencies require some collaterals. It could be in the form of gold or some wealth, and in French case, the confiscated church land as a consequence of the revolution was to serve as a collateral for the newly launched currency in France, and alongside that, we also have the civil constitution for clergy. And this civil constitution of clergy is to be understood with reference to again the earlier practice where it was the papacy, it was the Pope, it was from Rome that the rules and dictates of church governance came all across countries in Europe. And now it was not through some religious head, but it was made subservient to a civil constitution, and the religious part of it is gone. So obviously this was a big break, and those serving in different capacities and in the across the hierarchies in the church obviously were not amused. And in fact, despite having taken several blows in terms of reputation, the Catholic Christianity still had some bit of respect and hold over people's imagination, to the extent that this particular step of the government, where the clergy was made subservient to civil constitution, actually generated a lot of support for the counter revolution, those who did not want revolution, those who were opposed to these revolutionary changes. So in some segments of the peasantry and some sympathizers of the monarchy or royal order or the conservatives actually see this particular change as the reason as to why they got disenchanted with the revolution. Then over and beyond this document, we have the new constitution of 1791, which was the first constitution that France made for itself. It could never be implemented, all right. Nevertheless, what was contained in it allows historians to understand the aspirations and the nature and character of the revolution in the first stage. And if we study the new constitution of 1791 in France, we get this impression that this particular document or constitution testified the position now held by the dominant order. So although it was all being made in the name of common people, the third estate, assertion of the third estate, and even the poor will matter as equal as anyone who is rich or from the first two order. Despite all these claims, as per the constitution, it seemed that it stamped the position that the dominant order held in France. So the government, of course, had the monarchy had discredited itself, and it had just been a limited monarchy at this point of time, and supreme power virtually was a monopoly of the well-to-do. So as I told you towards the beginning, that still France is not a republic. Still the king is there, but he is just like a puppet, he is just like a prisoner of the revolutionaries. And it is the well-to-do amongst the third estate or well-to-do people who actually were running the show. And this is what is the picture that we get from this constitution of 1791. So the sense of democracy and participation had perhaps not percolated to the lower order of the third estate. And that it is the rumbling in the lower order of the third estate which will take France from first to second stage. Now, looking at the economic and governmental changes in the first stage of the revolution, we find that the church land that was sold off actually was parceled into bigger units, and obviously only those who were well off could buy it. Had it been parceled into smaller units, it could have perhaps been more democratic, and more people could have bought it and could have benefited out of it. But the sheer fact that the chunk of land that was carved out of the confiscated church land was big, therefore only the well-to-do could buy it, and these are the ways by which the monopoly and access of the well-to-do to the levers of power were maintained. Similarly, the traditional Institutions like guilds and trade unions also were done away with. Guilds obviously protected the interest of the particular community of carpenters, traders, or whatever of diverse pursuits. But it did not allow competition. It did not allow competition within itself, within the guilds. Now that ran counter to the ethics of capitalism, and therefore, and we all know that it is the bourgeoisie that is driving the revolution at this point of time, at least till this point of time, and therefore guilds and trade unions were stumbling blocks here, and they were done away with. So, the assertion of bourgeoisie is very prominent in the first stage. Then the local governments also were restructured, and this was done obviously to do away with any aristocratic domination that were surviving till around that point of time. France was divided into 84 departments or provinces as we know them popularly, and all local officials were to be elected locally. And this ensured that the French Revolution actually began with the spirit of decentralization, and this decentralization was also an assertion of individual liberty and freedom from ancient privilege. So, why I am saying this is because there is some kind of a reversal in the second stage of all these things. For example, the last point that I discussed about decentralization actually goes on to make a U-turn, and in the second stage of the French Revolution, it is a centralized picture of France that we get to see. Now, what are the reasons and what are the factors behind this that we will see in the second part of this lecture. However, it's important for us to remember that in the first stage, to begin with, the revolution started with the spirit of decentralization. It was a federal kind of republic or constitutional monarchy that was conceived by the bourgeoisie or the well-to-do amongst the third state, who were actually propelling the revolution to begin with. That's why they are also ensuring that the democratic institutions or liberal institutions of parliament, in French case, read it as the National Assembly, they get entrenched in French politics, and it is through these legislative deliberations that these changes were sought to be brought about. Why these things are important is because even today in the democratic liberal regimes, we agree and we presume that people's will is exercised through representative institutions, that is the parliaments of different countries or legislative institutions of different provinces within a country. Right, and any segment over and beyond this can also make occasional claims to represent people's will, but that is not accorded legitimacy in the liberal regime. So, democracy works all right, it has an intent, but it is a particular process that it has to follow. And in the first stage, we find that bourgeoisie, French bourgeoisie, is trying to bring about these changes. They were revolutionary, all right, with respect to the antecedents of France, but they were not as revolutionary as the people on the streets were expecting. And people on the streets were expecting more radical measures, and there was this perception gaining ground amongst the mobs or people on the streets of Paris, that these legislative changes have not touched their lives, their yearnings have not been addressed, and that it is that angst that shows its ramification in the intensification or in the radicalization of the movement. And when that radicalization starts happening in France, we today tend to study them as the second stage of the French Revolution. And that is what we shall be talking about in the next part of this lecture. Thank you.